Welcome to another episode of the Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today we're going to be talking about Alberta politics. I'm joined by longtime journalist and blogger David Climenhaga, and David's my go-to guy on what's going on the ground on specific issues in Alberta. So welcome to the Energy Show.
Thanks very much, Markham.
We now about 20% of our audience is in the United States, and many of them may not know that we're in fact in the midst of a national election here. And Alberta is playing an outsized role again in national politics. What the heck is going on the ground in Alberta, with respect to the campaign?
Well, we have a provincial government here that doesn't face an election for another couple of years. So it's fairly secure, but that there's no light between it and the federal Conservative Party, which is challenging the Liberal government, and so the provincial government is, I would argue, improperly, but in a way that's to be expected, is trying hard to intervene in the federal campaign, and I don't know that they're being very successful at it. The whole business, I guess there's another aspect here, is this provincial government is something new in Alberta. We've had separatist, or I think a better way to put it would be sovereignist, provincial politicians before, but we've never had a government that was dominated by them. And this government is, and I think that's a bit of a fluke, and I don't think that will persist in future Alberta history. But this is a government that has sovereignist beliefs, in that I don't believe they really want to separate completely from Canada. That would be such a spectacularly bad idea that even some of the dummies in the Premier's caucus must realize that. But they do want more powers to devolve to the province, and they are willing to play hardball and do some, I would say, unethical things, and some things that are unpopular, perhaps with a large number of people in their own electorate. So they're playing hardball to intervene in the federal election campaign. Add to that the fact that for months and months and months, and you've probably told your readers and listeners about this, for months and months and months, the Conservative Party was assumed to be a slam dunk to beat former Prime Minister Trudeau and to easily win the election. And then when Trudeau finally was really forced into quitting, because I personally don't think he wanted to, but when he left, and this new man, Mark Carney, who is a very sober, mean, and a person with a background in international finance, stepped into his role. Well, I have a theory about what happened, but the popularity of the Conservative Party just seemed to evaporate. So we now actually have the Liberals leading in the polls, according to, I was just before we started looking at recent polls. There's always somebody every day saying, well, here's a poll showing the Conservatives narrowing the gap, but the trend seems to be pretty solid. Now, we can talk about whether we believe those polls at some point too, but I think so the situation is that suddenly there's been this reversal in the way the election appears to be going, and people who have for months assumed that their party, the Conservative Party, was going to win, they're angry in addition to being worried. So this is,
So let's talk about that anger, because Preston Manning, and again for our American audience, Preston Manning was the first leader of the Reform Party, I think back in the early 90s, and sort of the grandfather of Canadian conservatism. And he's drifted right along with much of the Canadian conservative electorate. And he wrote a letter, an op-ed actually for the Globe and Mail, in which he basically said, give us everything we want here in Alberta, which is essentially what the oil and gas industry wants, or we're going to separate. And Andrew Coyne wrote a column a couple of days ago and said, you don't even have maybe 25% of the support for independence. At least you should have the numbers. And I pointed out that, essentially, Alberta has been frustrated in its oil and gas ambitions for a long time, and really that's what's behind it. But it seems like it's reached a crescendo. I mean, let's give the oil and gas industry what it wants, or we're taking our ball and going home. I think that's a new message, is it not?
Well, there have been people in Alberta history who have argued the same sort of thing, but they were never very influential. But I think I've got to take issue with a couple of things. I don't think Preston Manning is the grandfather of Canadian conservatism. I think Preston Manning is the grandfather of American conservatism in Canada.
Fair
It's
enough.
an important distinction because the Canadian conservatives were Tories. If you go way back, they descended from the people who supported the Crown in the American Revolution, and they have not been historically a pro-American group. And they have been more that like what we would call, they were conservatives, but they believed in government. This idea of MAGA government, Manning is very much in and has been for a long time with people on the American right who are so-called libertarians. I went to the 2013 Manning conference in Ottawa, which was a big annual shindig he threw, and his big guest was well, one of them was Nigel Farage, and the other one was not Rand Paul, but Ron Paul. Right, so you can see the kind of libertarian type far right people that he hung around with. So I don't think this is traditional Canadian conservatism, but and this is an important factor in the continued success of conservative parties in Canada, is they rely on people who are habitual conservative supporters who believe in who are conservative in the traditional sense of the word, and who think of the Conservative Party as being the old Canadian Tory party. I always say you can't use the term Tory to describe these new conservatives because they're MAGA conservatives and so on. So there's that. Now I've wandered a bit away from what you were asking me about, but I don't think this is really new. Remember also that Mr. Manning for decades has been involved in an effort to make the Canadian government structurally more like the American government. And this came out in the 80s and early 90s in this whole thing about a triple E or elected effective Senate rather than our rather undemocratic unelected Senate. But you know, that I don't think that's a good model for Canada to pursue, because the whole idea is to make it like the U.S. Constitution really exists to make it impossible to do anything about anything since 1778. And on the Canadian and the Westminster style of government, if you elect a majority government, they can really make a change. And so Manning's crowd, they don't want change to the things that they want to impose on. They want to be able to impose big change on Canada, but then they want it to be impossible to change. So they want to impose an American type political system on it. I don't think Canadians want that.
Here's the reason I asked the question. March 19th, 14 oil and gas CEOs, 4 from the pipeline industry and 10 from the big producers, issued a letter, an open letter to all the political parties. And in it, they said that they want to see, in order to realize their ambitions, they want to see the next prime minister declare a national energy crisis, echoing Donald Trump in the United States, and use, quote unquote, all available emergency powers to basically to quash opposition to pipelines and LNG plants and so on. And I pushed back hard on that. I said, that's extraordinary. You can't trample on people's constitutional rights just because it's inconvenient for you when you put in a pipeline application. And the fact that you would demand that is a huge tell to the rest of us about what you think about the democratic rights of Canadians. But that seems to be a popular idea in Alberta these days. And it doesn't matter what goes on in other parts of Canada. Alberta wants what it wants, and to hell with the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, but it's always been a bit like that, and it's quite hypocritical and it's anti-democratic. But the Conservative Party, as opposed to a crowd of business guys in an industry that over the long term is going to die, they're going to try stuff like this. And if they get away with it, they're going to impose it for a while. But history really doesn't appear to be on their side. But politically, this is again a neoliberal thing, where the government of Alberta is committed to economic liberty as defined by the Fraser Institute or by Austrian economists, but they're not committed to democracy as you and I would define it. Because when the people say, no, we want a more equitable system, they say, well, that runs against freedom. And there's been this strain for quite a while in aspects of the Canadian conservative movement, and it's been the loudest and the most entrenched in Alberta. But we're not dealing with your grandfather's Tories. That is correct. But I see this what's interesting now, this has been around for a while. If you don't do what we want, we'll take our ball and go home, or we'll take our ball and become the 51st state or whatever. But what's happening now is they're having their temper tantrum before they've lost the election. And that goes back to what we were talking about at the start, is that we've really been whipsawed, like, because it was for months the Conservatives were going to win and there was nothing you could do about it. And I was writing things. I'll admit that I was saying, well, we're just going to have to get used to this and figure out how to deal with it. And then bang, suddenly we're looking at a whole new world. So I have a little theory about this. It's sort of like Pierre Poilievre, the man the Conservatives chose as their leader. People want change, and there's been a real appetite for change all over the world in politics. But he set himself up as the anti-Trudeau. And he worked for month after month after month at assailing, I think very unfairly in some ways, but assailing Justin Trudeau's record, assailing the father, Pierre Trudeau's record as well, describing the Trudeaus as evil. And so he became, I call him the anti-Trudeau, right? Like the Antichrist. And but now what's he going to do? Well, Trudeau's gone. He's left the scene. And so I think people are sick of Poilievre for the same reason. He's kind of been too successful. He was so successful at making Canadians sick of Trudeau that they're sick of him too, because he's the anti-Trudeau. So now he's dealing with a completely different guy.
Well, let's talk about that guy. Mark Carney is the former governor of the Bank of Canada. He's the former governor of the Bank of England. He kind of helped to steer UK through Brexit. Not very well, apparently, but
according to some people, but
yeah. So anyway, and he's been very active in climate finance at the global level for quite a long time now. So he's a banker with a PhD in economics from Oxford, and he comes across as exactly that kind of guy. He's very sober. You said he was sober mean, and I would agree with you. And that seems to be gathering some support in Alberta. There are folks who are talking about, maybe the Liberals will get more seats in Alberta than in a long, long time. What's your take on that?
Well, we'll see about that. I mean, there's absolutely no question he's getting a lot of support, and we all talk to our neighbors, and all of our neighbors don't share our politics. And I see in my neighborhood circle, I see a lot more credibility adhering to Mr. Carney than was adhering to Mr. Trudeau in the last couple of years, or the last few months of his leadership. And but whether that's going to translate into votes in Alberta is problematic, because the Conservative vote is so habitual and so heavy here. In most parts of the province, that it's a fairly high bar to overcome in a first past the post system with often two progressive parties. The Liberals here have put their campaign together very, very hurriedly, and they've actually got some excellent candidates, but who haven't been campaigning until yesterday or the day before. So they're really coming from behind. The NDP have actually been in Edmonton been better organized, because they've got some MPs. They've got a large contingent in the provincial legislature, and they've got some infrastructure in the Edmonton area. So, whether the Liberals can live up to the kind of popular support they seem to have, from what I've been just picking up from various polls, might be as high as 30%. Well, that's significant. It's important. And it's important if we have a referendum on separation. We should come back to that topic. But I don't know that it'll be enough to push them over the top in most Alberta ridings. So I would be surprised. I'd be delighted personally, because I think we need that. But I would be surprised if there were more than one or two Liberals elected in this province. Not there. I don't think there's going to be 6 or 7, as people have been talking about. We'll see. I hope I'm wrong.
Fair enough. I want to talk to you about the NDP campaign, because the NDP usually polls around 18 to 20 nationally, and it's down around the 8 or 9% in the polls that I've seen. And Jagmeet Singh, the leader, has just been almost invisible in this campaign, as far as I can see anyway. So what do you make of that? And also, how's the NDP doing in the federal campaign in Alberta?
Well, oddly, in some ways, I think the NDP may be doing better here than in Edmonton. I think they have a chance in 3 ridings, right? They occupy 2 and could pick up a 3rd one, but we'll see. But I don't know. I have not been impressed with the leader, Jagmeet Singh, for quite a while now. I think he's on the wrong track. I think we basically have a situation where we have three neoliberal parties in English Canada that have a chance of getting elected. And and New Democrats and Liberals don't really like each other, but on a policy sense, there's very little light between them. And so you've got really, I'm not advocating that the NDP and the Liberals join forces, but I really think that by creeping so close to the Liberals through the last couple of leaders, that the NDP has really made themselves potentially irrelevant in this. But then this is one of those circumstances where people have turned to there's an external threat, and they've turned to large numbers of people to Mr. Carney as the most likely person to be able to deal with that threat. And I think that's bad news for the NDP Canada-wide. Here, though, there are these three ridings, and just add to the two they hold, Edmonton Centre, where they have good candidates who are either MPs or have been campaigning for a while, who have an opportunity to win or to place really well. So I think Heather McPherson's probably, in a way, it's probably the safest non-conservative seat in Western Canada. They're very well organized there. They've got the same organization as that was Rachel Notley's riding, basically the same territory. And they've got the same organizational structure by and large. So they've been mad at each other. The provincial and the federal levels of the party have been mad at each other from time to time. But I think, the NDP is really safe in that riding. Whether Blake can stay and Griesbach, well, we'll see. But he's got a strong Liberal candidate, apparently, but who's only been campaigning for a couple of days. And he's got Kerry Dayat, who was, in my opinion, the worst MP in the Parliament since Rob Anders left. So,
what do you make of? Let's just deviate or wander over to the provincial side for a moment and talk about the NDP there, because for American viewers, Rachel Notley was the NDP leader chosen in 2014. She was the premier of Alberta from 2015 to 2019. Then she stepped down, and Naheed Nenshi was chosen last year, and he's a former Calgary mayor. In fact, he was the world's best mayor at one point in 2014. So,
according to someone,
whoever handed out the title,
whoever decides who the world's best mayor is,
David Nenshi. But the problem here is that there were really high expectations, I think, for Nenshi, and a sense of disappointment from the people that I talked to that he hasn't been more of a factor in some of these discussions. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's legitimate, and it's not legitimate in the sense that he has run the party, in my opinion, in a very passive way. And I think some months ago I wrote a piece that had a title something like "Whatever's becoming where's Naheed Nenshi? What's he doing?" People were very quiet. They kept a very low profile. He didn't seem to step out on a number of things, and when he did speak up on issues, they were Calgary issues, not Alberta issues. And I don't think that was the NDP elected him by 86.5%, if I remember correctly, but more than 86%. And they did that because they thought this is the person of the candidates most likely to campaign effectively against the premier, Danielle Smith, who is a far right, ideological, hard right person, but very engaging and a good speaker, and gives the impression that she's very interested in people. So she actually maintains quite a bit of popularity. And then she's been very passive. So that's the I share the disappointment side. On the other hand, in our Canadian system, he does not have a seat in the legislature, and he's not been able to get one because the premier gets to call the by-election. So he's running, and he's been nominated by the NDP to run in Ms. Notley, the former NDP leader and the former Alberta premier's riding. But she won't call a by-election, and hasn't yet. And she's got until June. She'll do it at the last minute. I think they want to wait until after the federal election. So they don't want him in the legislature asking questions at question period. It may well be that he's more effective when he gets there.
Let's talk for a moment about Danielle Smith. Bit of a loose cannon, and spent 8 or 9 years. First, she was leader of the Wild Rose Party, almost premier in 2012, but lost out. Then crossed the floor to the Progressive Conservatives. Then eventually became a conservative talk show host in Calgary. So now she's got the trouble. the party, and I mean, Pierre Poilievre and the CPC in big trouble with her comments on Breitbart News, where she was talking about how maybe, Poilievre would be very simpatico to the Trump administration. And she's come out with all sorts of threaten a national unity crisis if the federal government didn't give the oil and gas industry everything it wanted. Is there nothing she can do that that won't provoke a response in Alberta?
I'm not sure what your last question meant, but I mean, anything she does, she's the premier. Anything she does is going to provoke a response here. But I'm not sure that we're looking at this the right way, because the assumption is that she's so angry that there's a potential that a federal conservative government won't be elected, that she's willing to threaten national unity in order to get that to happen. But I don't know that that's right. I have a suspicion that Ms. Smith would actually prefer there to be a Liberal government in Canada, because she is a sovereigntist, and she does want to continue with this effort to increase Alberta's powers in confederation, and or to gin up a national crisis to benefit Alberta in other ways. And if you've got a conservative government that's inclined to cooperate with her, or at least ideologically in tune, that's not as good a foil. I mean, they had Trudeau, and Trudeau had been made to be, people had been encouraged to think of him as a very bad premier in Alberta, and a lot of people bought into that. And there were certainly policies that he advocated that were becoming a problem, but the hatred for him didn't match the lack of success he was having. But he was a great foil, right? You could say Trudeau, people would curl their lips, and there were people driving pickup trucks around town with big F Trudeau flags and nonsense like this, right? So when Carney comes along, none of this stuff is stuck to him. The Mr. Poilievre calls him carbon tax Carney. Well, what's he do? He says, well, I'm getting rid of that carbon tax. Well, I would think Poilievre would have been smarter to say, well, thank you for accepting my idea. I'll even have more good ideas if you elect me as prime minister. But I don't know that actually Premier Smith isn't trying to give Mr. Poilievre a gentle shove, because I suspect she'd rather deal with a weak Liberal government than with a strong Conservative government. And anyway, when Conservatives are in power, because Alberta is such a power base for them, they never do much for Alberta. It's not like we're saying, well, if you ignore us, we'll vote for another party. We're saying, no, if you ignore us, we'll vote for you anyway. Well, that's not a very good technique for bludgeoning a political party into doing what you want.
Not as a rule. The reason I asked the question was because it sounds like you're arguing that her goal here is sovereignty association or some kind of a altered relationship with the Confederation of Canada. At the very least, more powers for Alberta, more like maybe relative to Quebec, that sort of thing. As where I see it a little differently, Dave. The way, from my point of view, the oil and gas industry believes that between now and 2050 is the last hurrah. Now that I don't share that. I don't think the evidence and the data would support that, but that's what they believe. OPEC believes it. They modeled it.
Mm-hmm.
Alberta believes it. And so they're putting as much pressure on the federal government to approve pipelines, approve LNG projects, all of that, because this is their the last boom they will not pee away.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally think that motivates her a lot to try to use these levers like a threat of a national unity crisis to try to get the government to move.
Well, I'm not dismissing that as a factor in this, or perhaps the major factor, but I do think that she is a sovereignty association type. I think that's what she's really aiming for, and that she's trying to use this crisis to further those ends too. I mean, the oil industry is going to do what the oil industry is going to do to try and maximize their profits as long as possible, and then walk away from it. And the Alberta government, regardless of who is running the government here, and this was true when the NDP was in charge too, is really captured by the oil industry. And so when they make big threats to the government in power at the time really takes it seriously. But it would be worse, to go back to where we started, it would be worse if we had an American-style government that was completely sclerotic and couldn't change anything other than leaving the incremental things that are given to the oil companies as time goes on to them. You remember that how much higher our royalties were back in the day of Peter Lougheed, who was a conservative, than they are now, right? So we've seen the value we're getting from this resource constantly diminished in order to keep jobs up here, and yet we're not keeping the jobs because automation is getting it. So
I do have a question for you, and that is, you'll remember back in Rachel Notley's government, oil prices fell off a cliff in 2015, 2016. They started to recover. 2017, then there was a problem with the Keystone Pipeline, and prices went down again. So for most of all four budgets that Notley brought in were running a deficit. Some of them, quite high. And there was screaming from the Conservatives in Alberta about that. Now, here we have Smith running a budget this year, and by the look of it, low oil prices are going to cut back natural, oil and gas revenues, and it'll be higher than she projected. And yet, I don't hear a peep about that.
Well, there's not much, but this has to do with the corporate structure of media, I think. There's independent guys like you who will say maybe this is a problem, or maybe or point to the irony of the different ways it's covered. But typically, conservative governments in North America and in Western Europe too get a pass on budget deficits because they have an anti-deficit kind of rhetoric. And a government, particularly one like Trudeau's, as opposed to Carney's, who talked about the need to share the wealth and to have social programs that are expensive that will benefit all citizens of the country. Then they come under this concerted budget attack. It's crazy. We're robbing our grandchildren and so on. But Paul Krugman, the economist who used to write for the New York Times, writes about this all the time. How conservatives in the States get a pass when they ignore the things that they demand of Democrats. Well, so here in Canada, we have a print media that's basically entirely owned in English Canada by an American venture capital fund. And we're shocked that they behave like American journalists in the same circumstances. Come on, this is the way the world is now.
Well, you would know, Dave, as you have a long and storied history in the newspaper business in Alberta and in Canada. So, look, thank you very much for this. I always enjoy our conversations, and we'll have you back on later on, maybe after the April 28th election, and we'll see who's government and what we might expect from them.
Okay, well, you know where to find me.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.